194, and we're going to continue with our remembrances of the early days of the village of Rogers and Rogers City. We were talking at the end of the last tape about Michigan Line providing transportation for the men who lived in town and who worked at the quarry. Now, in the early days, right after the start of the plant got some passenger cars from the D&M, and they were stored right at the plant. And the plant used those cars along with an engine. They came into town along the D&M track up as far as the depot, and then they came along and picked up the men who were going to go to work at the plant. I, on a few occasions, especially in 1927, did ride that train. And it went down through town, 10 cents a ride, and brought you back later on in the afternoon. And if there was an afternoon shift, well, then it ran again. But before there were enough cars around, and before there were enough homes around, of course, many of the men stayed in boarding houses here in town or in private homes. Later on, you remember, Michigan Line built dozens and dozens of homes along South 2nd Street, which was called Battlefront, up in the Tank Edition area, along South 1st Street, along South Lake Street. Dozens and dozens of homes were built for the workers and executives of Michigan Line. Those homes are still there today. Now, the train ran along the tracks, which later D&M used every day, and train was set aside down there until the shift ended. Now later on, of course, the buses replaced the trains. In the years probably around 28 or 29, I caught the bus right in front of the house on 3rd Street. And the same again, I think it was about 10 cents a ride. Now I don't know just when those buses continued to not operate, when most people would go by cars, but it was well after World War II. Now, what are some of the other so-called sounds that I recall from the early days in Rogers City? One of them were the church bells. Now, in St. Ignatius, just up the street from our old home, there was an Angelus that rang at noon, rang again at 3 in the afternoon, and it rang at 6 in the evening. Now, at St. John's, the bell, as you remember, during the Sunday church services, the bell tolled 3 times during the recitation of the Lord's Prayer, which followed the sermon or the homily. And they still do that. The church bells, all the church bells in the town, of course, rang at midnight on New Year's Eve. Now, another thing of the early town, you recall, was the Bradley Farms, located at the end of 5th Street. Now, the Bradley Farms supplied fresh milk for the people of Rogers City. Carl D. Bradley, the president of the early days, wanted a fresh milk supply for these workers at the plant and their families. And they took over and operated a farm which had been previously operated by the Thompson family and then the Nagel family. And Carl D. Bradley built a model operating dairy farm there. Prize cattle were brought in, barns were built, processing center was set up, and he was assisted in experts from Michigan State Agricultural College at that time, later Michigan State, now Michigan State University. Now, with Mr. Bradley, that farm was his hobby. It was his money, but it was not a moneymaker. And when Bradley died in 1928, the dairy farm slowly closed. And in a few years it was gone. And the milk supply came in from the surrounding farms just as it does today. Now, other sounds and signs that I recall, and sights I recall from my many, many years of hunting and fishing as a young man, and even as an older man. I spent a lot of time out in the woods, a lot of time along the rivers. And I spent many, many days in the duck blinds at Lost Lake and at Lake May, Lake Nettie. Duck hunting was my prized fall hobby, along with deer hunting. But I had several blinds. One of them I had for many, many years, of course, was at Lost Lake, where Mother and Dad owned a good chunk of property, about 3/8 of a mile on the lake itself. I'd get out there early in the morning before light, put out the decoys, and you could hear the sound of the first flight of ducks as they passed by. This would be in the fall of the year, late September, October, November. You could hear the whistle of the golden-eye duck as it flew by. You could hear the curring sound of the bluebills as they sat in a group out in the lake, a flock. Or you could hear the deep quack of the mallard and the black duck as they fed along shore. Or you could hear the tweet of the wood duck, or the honk of the Canada geese that flew high overhead going south. Now, back of me right in the hills there at Lost Lake, you could often hear in the fall of the year the bark of the coyotes chasing deer. You could hear the hoot and sometimes see the big owls. And the big owls would talk to each other, almost as if to say, well, come on over here. I spotted a partridge, or I spotted a mouse on the ground. And then there are other sounds of the woods, which I will talk about later. Now, got misplaced there a minute. Out of the corner of my eye, as I sat in that blind on several occasions, I would spot a red fox. There were a good supply of them in the hills there. And one of the fox would spot the decoys, moving maybe 10 yards offshore, rocking in the breeze. Very, very attractive sight to a fox. These fox would come along there, and they wouldn't spot you because the wind was bright. And they might stick their feet in the water a little bit, probably in their own mind say, well, how do I get at those fellows out there? Well, maybe after 10 minutes they would decide that it was a no-go, try it some other day. Then right in back of you, right in the hills, a deer would snort. Now, quite often if a deer snorted, it meant that he detected something but couldn't spot it. I'd be sitting in a blind, pretty much concealed. Deer sometimes under those conditions will stomp their front feet, a thump, thump. Or they'll let out a small blat, and then they will move off. Other times you could catch the distinct odor of a skunk that had been disturbed. Or you'd catch the distinct odor of a mink. Now, the mink has a very strong odor that it emits, stronger than a skunk. Once you get a whiff of it, you'll always remember it. In the distance, you could hear the eerie call of the loon. Wait a few seconds, and a mate would answer from another pond or another lake. And we used to say that was loon talk. Very beautiful sound. Another fascinating hobby that I had at that time, and I spent a lot of time out there in that area with my friend Lyman Polk, who lived there, is that we would go frog hunting in June. Frog hunting at night with a boat on the lake. We'd wait for a nice warm evening in June, and the frogs, after it got thoroughly dark, would set up their band. And they sounded like a big band, like big horns of sousaphones or trombones or French horns. And they would give a grump, grump, grump Well, you could pick them up very easy with a flashlight, going along the shore, hold a flashlight on them, they'd stay still. Pick up a couple dozen of those great big frogs where we use only the hind legs, and you had yourself a wonderful, wonderful frog dinner. Marion liked frog legs, and she knew how to fry them. A little bacon grease, a little butter, a little amount of onion, a little amount of garlic, and man, it was ambrosia. Marion also knew how to make Hasenpfeffer. She liked rabbit. And quite often during the course of the year, she would special order a rabbit from the butcher, and we'd have several good meals of Hasenpfeffer. Now also at that time of the year, I helped Lyman Polk on many occasions trap turtles. These were good-sized turtles, weighed 25, 30, 40 pounds in certain cases. That's wonderful eating meat. And also, I didn't do this, but he trapped beaver and he trapped muskrat, and those are wonderful eating animals. They're vegetarian and make delicious food if you know how to prepare them. And of course, his wife Dorothy, when they lived out there, she knew how to do that. Now, the beaver is an excellent food, and the Sportsman's Club of Presque County used to put on beaver dinners. In the late spring of the year, they would buy these carcasses off of the trappers, and usually they were kept frozen until they got enough for a big dinner, and then they would have a big dinner prepared by one of the local churches. Usually those places were sold out for that event. Now, they did serve other beef and pork products, too, in case somebody didn't like the beaver, but the beaver was always all gone. Now, other sounds that I remember from my many, many days in the woods, especially trout fishing along the Akiak, was the sound in the spring of the year of the partridge drumming on a log. Or as you walked along, you could spot the trailing arbutus and mayflower, very, very fragrant, as you remember. Or you could see the cardinal flower, that brilliant red. Very rare, but very beautiful. Or there was the trillium lilies by the thousands. We used to call them Marion's flowers because they always came out on May 16th, her birthday. There were the beautiful yellow cowslips along the rivers, along the creeks. And then there was the very, very beautiful wild orchid, what we call the lady slippers, the yellow and the pink lady slippers. I had a couple of those in my yard. I picked up the whole plants and brought them in and planted them. They survived for many, many years. Our mother, Elma, had some growing in her yard. I brought those in for her. Now, those flowers were protected, but I brought some in my fish basket. I didn't take the flowers, I took the whole plants. And then there are the beautiful wild dwarf orchid, or iris, that grew along the river banks. A few of them even grew out in the Lost Lake area. These were the dwarf iris. And then in the more open areas of what we call the plains, near the big pines, there would be the smell of bracken, which was the wild fern. And then there was the pungent odor of the leatherleaf bog near Lost Lake. In the spring of the year, the beautiful wild cherry trees that would be in blossom. The orange tiger lilies, spotted with black, always came out about June 25th. There are the blossoms of the elderberry and the blossoms of the beautiful, beautiful blossoms of the blackberry. That's one of the most beautiful blossoms in the woods, the blackberry flower. Sitting along the bank of the Akiak, it was always a thrill, landing a nice big 5-pound steelhead trout, or just getting a mess of brook trout or brown trout or rainbow trout. I recall many, many times going out at midnight fishing on the big Akiak, certain selected spots in a new well, fishing for brown trout. Always a thrill to go out there at night and listen to the sounds of animals walking by you in the woods. You didn't know whether it was a bear, you didn't know whether it was a deer. But always kind of sent a thrill up and down your spine. I remember on several occasions fishing on the Big Akiak and looking up, there across the creek would be a bear. On one occasion I remember there was a sow bear and she had 3 young cubs about 18 inches long. They were munching on huckleberries. I remember the old lady kind of looking at me for a full 10 minutes and finally deciding, well, there was no harm there, so she ambled on. Glad that she did, because I had no place to run. The river wasn't that deep that would stop her. I never often wondered what would I do. What would have happened had I just got onto a great big trout at the same time that bear spotted me? I don't know whether I'd throw the pole in and run or what I would do. I didn't have to make that decision. Then there was the very fragrant and beautiful flower of the thorn apple, the wild thorn apple. There were the red stalks of the sumac in the fall of the year, and the cigar-sized cattails in the swamp areas. In the fall, the oak trees, many of them would be loaded with acorns. Or the beechnut trees would be located with that shaped nut, the beechnut. And hazelnuts, on certain hazelnut trees would be loaded. Marion and I often in the early days went out and picked hazelnuts. We call them today, in the stores you call them filberts. And there's a technique in picking them because the hull is very, very picky, burry. You use leather gloves and soak the burrs off in water. And Marion and I picked wild strawberries, we picked wild huckleberries, we picked blackberries, some to can, some to eat. Now, on a good many occasions, along the river, I would encounter deer. And if a deer suddenly jumped up right along the river someplace, ran a few steps, stopped, ran a few steps and stopped, you knew that she was trying to distract you from something. And if you looked very carefully and very closely and didn't move too fast, you might spot a young fawn or a twin fawns in the grass. The mother had instructed them to sit tight. You didn't touch an animal of that kind, you just admired it and then went on. Pretty soon the old lady would come back. But the young spotted fawns were very, very beautiful sight. By listening, as you sat there along the river, you would occasionally see a fox or a skunk or a beaver and occasionally an otter. Or you'd see a porcupine or a weasel or some of the other creatures that came down to the river to drink. Just sit quietly and wait. On occasions, you would spot a coon or a mink right in the river itself, in water that was maybe 3-4 inches deep, returning over rocks. They were looking for crabs, or they were looking for other crustaceans like snails or clams, and even small fish. Interesting to watch. Very, very interesting sight to watch these creatures hunt for themselves. Now, other sounds that I recall from up here in Rogers City was, along the river again, the sassy call of the kingfisher. They were raucous creatures, or birds, you might say. And if they were on the river, and you were on the river, you're both looking for one thing, you're looking for trout. They were excellent fishers. Locally here in town, the call of the seagulls bringing the fish tugs in with their catches out in the lake. You could hear at night around town, you had the sound of the nighthawks chasing insects in the warm summer evenings. In the old days, a good number of those nighthawks had their nests and raised their young on the roof of the high school. That was a gravel roof, heavily graveled, and the conditions must have just been right. I remember going up there on top of that roof, and there would be a dozen nests up there of the nighthawks. I don't think that's true anymore because the roof has been changed to a different type of a cover, but originally it was a gravel roof. There was 2-3 inches of gravel, pea gravel, right on top of that roof, and it must have been just ideal. And this up there, they might encounter a goshawk, but not too much. Along the river also, especially along the Big Akyuk in the lake area around Lake Nettie, if you were fishing for bullheads in the river, along with Dad, you would hear the thump, thump, thump call of the big bittern, which is a heron-type bird. Very peculiar call. Or you could see a blue heron on its long legs fishing in the shallows. Also a familiar sight in the early days, hunting in the area, partridge hunting, you would see a red-tailed hawk lazily circling over an open field or a meadow. Stop the car for a while and just watch it. He was trying to spot a field mouse or a gopher or a chipmunk or a rabbit or a partridge. Then there would be a sudden dive. The wings would fold and whammo. He would hit the ground with full force. Feathers would fly. Sometimes it would be dust. Sometimes he scored, sometimes he didn't score. That was kind of nature in the raw, memorable sight. I've seen it many times. And I used to see it right in our backyard here in Rogers City, where the goshawks would come in and get a meal of mourning dove. The mourning doves were slow in flight. The goshawk knew they were here, and he'd come in and he would swoop down and he'd nail them right in midair. Sometimes the hawk would miss. They'd crash into our back windows here. We got 10 foot of back windows in this kitchen. And they would kill themselves, going right into this heavy thermopane window. At least probably over the period of years, maybe 10 or 12 hawks have killed themselves right on this window. It must be the light conditions. They figure it's open sky. They miss the dove and bango. And if you're sitting here when that happens, you'll jump about 3 feet. Also in the woods, and in the, not also in the, at any time the spring of the year, you would get the scent of cherry blossoms, or of apple blossoms, or pear or plum. In May, that's very, very fragrant. Then there was the sights and smells of Mother's flower garden, or all over on 3rd Street. Mother was a real flower gardener, as you remember. She had roses. She had chrysanthemums and phlox and foxglove, delphinium, pansies and tulips, nasturtiums and carnations, lilies of many varieties, iris, peonies. Now that peony, some of those peony plants came from the old Grambua farm in Metz. Some of those peony plants had actually survived the Metz fire because, as you recall, the Metz fire came in October. The plants were down and the roots were underground. That's how come some of those plants survived. Then there were the spirea plants along the side of the house. They're still there today. There were the sweet pea trellises. There was the morning glory. There were the bachelor buttons. There were the snapdragons and the daffodils. Just to name a few. Mother had, as you know, a very, very green thumb. I was thinking also of the shrubbery that was in the yard, especially in the area right next to the garage. And next to the driveway was a shrub known as the caragana that produced a little flower and a little pea pod in the fall. Those caragana plants were from North Dakota by Mother and Dad when he was out there on a trip for the bank. They're still there today, still a beautiful plant. Now, while I still have a little left room on this tape, I want to talk a little bit about Lost Lake and the family property out there. Now, Mother and Dad owned about 100 acres of land in that area, and about 3/8 of a mile of land was on Lost Lake itself. Mother and Dad had purchased that land along with C.H. Osgood. They bought about 240 acres there of cut-over timberland. It was available, and I think they paid 50 cents an acre. In other words, they had 100 acres. They paid about $50 for that 100 acres. And it had about 3/8 of a mile of frontage. Now, I had a boat there, duck boat, for many, many years. A boat that Marion had purchased for me for along about 1946. I had that boat there for about 25 years. Before that, when the family went out there, before there was a road in there that Dad had built, we rented boats, went out there for outings. And we used to go out there bass fishing at night and bullhead fishing. Dad thoroughly enjoyed going out there bullhead fishing. He'd come home with a few bullheads and maybe stop at Herman Eagle's on the way back to have a beer, go into the basement, clean them up, and have a fresh bullhead feed, maybe even at midnight. Mother usually fried them in a little bacon grease and butter, a little pepper. Well done. It was real ambrosia, along with a cup of coffee and a bottle of beer, or some of Mother's famous brown bread. I'm sure that George and Martha and Ernestine will remember that, because I know that Arnie was there on several occasions for that event. And that is when they would come up from Detroit. Now, Lost Lake was where the whole family hunted deer. The years that I hunted, some 35, and every one of those deer was shot on the property at Lost Lake. And I know that Arnie got deer there, Gene did, Wayne did, and other family members. I think, George, you hunted there for deer. Now, Mother and Dad also, here we go. Mother and Dad also owned 40 acres of land in Section 16 of Metz Township, which was known as the schools section of each township. And while I recall going out there for a picnic, Dad and I, and maybe taking one of the Kazans along, would go out there almost every fall to do a little partridge hunting. Now, later on, that 40 was sold to Uncle Henry. He harvested it for the logs that he could get out of it, and then he sold it. Now, Dad and Mother did own other lots at times, parcels of land. They one time had a lot at Lake Neddy in addition to the Spitzer Club. They had a lot at Grand Lake. And Mother and Dad, along with Bertha and Louise, had 3 lots in the Pinewood addition to the village of Rogers. Now, Marion and I, after we were married, we bought those 3 lots. One from Dad, one from Aunt Louise, and one from Aunt Bertha, with the idea that that's where we would build our home. Beautiful lots. But the only thing that happened is that somebody bought the lots directly across from that and put up overnight cabins. Well, that ended that dream, and so we bought the lot on which the house stands at the present time over here on 6th Street. Now, Mother and Dad, or Mother and Bertha and Louise, also owned lots in the village of Metz. Now, that village at one time had been platted, it had been surveyed, and there's a registered up in the Register of Deeds office. You can go and see the plats. Now, I do not know who they sold those lots to, but it was sometime after World War I that they disposed of those lots. Another thing I recall was that, about Mother, was that she told me, which is kind of interest, is that when she was born, a savings account was opened for her in a Detroit bank by her aunt, Marie Zimmerman. The account was in her name with Julius and Teresa Gramberg, of course. Now, that account was kept intact and started in 1889. And Mother said that she did not transfer the account until after 1908, after she got married, and she transferred the account to the Presqu'île Bank. She said there was over $100 in the account. She was so surprised. Periodically, she said she had received a notice, but ordinarily, unless you wrote, you didn't get the notice. She said she couldn't figure out how that much money got in there, but it must have been apparently, because she said she did, as a younger girl, occasionally send a few dollars down by train to deposit in that account and get a receipt for it. And but when the money came, there it was. Most of the money apparently had been put in by Aunt Mary, or Aunt Marie as they call her, the sister of Grandpa Dramberg.